I want to thank everybody for joining our meetup today. We continue to have our online meetups, waiting for the day we return to physical presence. But until then, we continue to bring up great content and speakers into our group, and have a chance to come together. Today is no exception. We have a fantastic speaker with us, Shawn Wildermuth, has been tinkering with computers and software since he got his VIC-20 back in the early 80s. A Microsoft MVP since 2003. He's also involved with Microsoft as an ASP.NET Insider and Client Dev Insider. You may have taken one of his more than 20 courses on Plural sites. And I know we were talking about this earlier. Some of us here have, for sure. He's authored 8 books and many articles on software development. You can see him at one of the local or international conferences. He's spoken at TechEd, Orlando Dev, SDC, NDC, VS Live, Dev Intersection, Mix, Dev Teach, Dev Connection, and Dev Reach. Whew, what a list.
And all very old conferences, too. I need to update my bio.
Good big conferences, though. Very impressive list there, sir. He's one of the Wilder minds, for sure. You can reach him at his blog at wildermuth.com. And one last thing, he's released his first film, a feature-length documentary about software developers today, called Hello World, the film. You can see more about it at helloworldfilm.com. Shawn, it's a big pleasure having you here with our small group. Thank you very much, sir. Take it away.
I'll go ahead and share my screen. Oh, good. We can get the infinite people on the screen. Good. So if I could get, I don't know that they allow you to raise hands or not in Meet, but if you could unmute your microphone since there's only a few of us. How many of you have used Vue before? Okay, a couple of you. This just changes the way I do one of the demos in here. One of them is talking about whether you've done Vue a lot, and the other is talking about if you. So, I appreciate it. Can you guys see my screen okay? Anyone? Can you see my screen?
Yep. Oh, yep. You did.
Thank you.
Yes, sorry.
Suddenly I thought maybe I wasn't showing my screen. So I'm Shawn Wildermuth. I'm out of Atlanta, and I'm really glad to be here. I can't see any of you. I only have one monitor, so if you have questions or whatever, just unmute your microphone and interrupt me. He's already talked about who I am, Pluralsight, and my film, which I won't dive into too much deeper. And we're just going to dive into a demo. I'm not a big fan of having 100 slides to explain it. But the big story here is that near when the new version of Vue was released, Vue 3, they introduced this idea called the Composition API as a new way to build Vue applications. And they actually backported it to Vue 2 as well. So it didn't matter whether you're using the old stuff or the new stuff, you could sort of opt into it. So let's talk about that by looking at code. I have a Vue app just running here, and I'll go ahead and show you what it looks like in the browser. It's just a really simple, it goes and hits an API and shows some books and allows you to mark them whether you've read them or not, or check them out. Make sense?
Yeah.
And this is using the older style of development with Vue. So Vue is a single-page application framework. It was you can use it directly in the browser, sort of like you could Knockout back in the day, or you can build whole applications with Webpack and using a CLI and a more modern way of developing these single-page applications. It's similar in a lot of ways to Angular and React. It sort of sits in the middle of the two of them. And for a long time, it has this notion of single-file components, and that's let me actually show you this one. That's where they have in one file a template that represents the UI that you're building, and this is normally HTML. We can explain why it says books there in a little bit. And then the code that relates to what you're building here, and then optionally any styling that you want for that if you don't have them in centralized CSS someplace. And so for a long time, they built them like this, where you had a structured object that had different properties that had different pieces. And so data is the things that you want to bind against. Methods are actions that you can take. And then there are several special ones that are for the life cycle. And mounted is one that happens when your application gets started. So essentially, this gets shown, this page gets started. I go and call an API. This is just hidden in a method, an API that's going to go get some books from a public website that has an API to return book information. I take this empty book list, and one of the things that Vue does here is they take the data you're related to this and they tack it onto the this pointer for whether they're methods or in the mounted functions. And so what's happening behind the scenes in this old style is a lot of magic. Like it isn't necessarily something that was really easy for something like Typescript to work with. And so they came up with a sort of a class syntax. Really quiet. I just want to make sure we're still running. Yeah. Okay. Good. With this class syntax, which is closer to what Angular does and familiar for like C# people, and that works. But there's still a lot of magic that's going on. You need attributes in order to hook a bunch of things up. And I wasn't a big fan of that. It's one of the reasons why I'm not in love with the way Angular does things, because every component is a class, and you end up writing attributes that are half the page long, and then 4 lines of code that represents the actual guts of the component. And so what the Vue team did was say, oh, we're going to look at this other way that we're going to call the composition API, and they suggested that it was going to be one way, and the community freaked out. They were like, no, you're totally wrong, and they actually changed the direction of this thing called the composition API, because one of the problems with this sort of style is it's hard to test. Like, you take this magic object, and unless it's being run through the Vue engine, this isn't very JavaScripty, right? It's just an object that has these properties, and you could call those properties maybe, but the this pointer won't have this book list on it to write a test against unless you're running it through sort of a Vue engine. And so it really coupled itself to the runtime motivation of the Vue engine. And so what they came up with is something called the composition API. And so let's talk about that. I'm going to get rid of this entirely, the old style. We can talk about the new style. The new style looks a lot like it. You're going to export a default object. And so at first, it's going to look like what they call the options API. That was the one I had been showing. But there's a new method called setup. And setup is kind of magical in that it is where you're going to set up all of the things that you want to interact on the page. And so the first thing we can do is say book list, right? And create an array. And then whatever we return from this ends up being this bindable object that all of this code can go up against. So this ends up being available here. So that's why being able to look at the book list here in, let's say, a v4 works, because this is just returning a book list. So why would this matter? Like, why would this style be really any different from anything we could do? The reason is, instead of having magic, it's using JavaScript closures. So let me explain what I mean by that. If we have a function here that says count, we could return book list.length, right? And the reason why this count, if we're going to use it somewhere in our UI, works is because this exists inside of this scope, right? Because this is representing a function scope. And even if count isn't returned, it still is going to have a hook and keep this around for as long as it needs to, as long as this object lives. And so we end up using more natural JavaScript-ness about this. So let's get rid of count, and let's actually implement this in the way it's supposed to work, which again is having a list of books and then being able to show them in some way. And so first thing I'll do is I'll create a function. Take that back. First thing I'm going to do is, yeah, that was right. Create a function called load. And all that load is going to do is it's going to call, I have an HTTP class that says get books. Now I need to import this because, of course, it's right there. So it's this method that actually gets the books, and it expects it to be asynchronous. I'm going to make the function asynchronous. I'm going to wait on this, and then I'm going to get the result. And there I said var, which I should have said const. And then I can just say if result success, which is one of the pieces of data that gets returned. And just to make sure you see what this is doing, it's just getting the result from a website, open library. And if it's a 200, it returns true and the books. Otherwise, it returns false. So if it's true, then what can I do here? I can say book list equals result books. Right? I'm just going to assign them. Now, of course, immediately it's saying can't assign because this is a constant. I could make this a let. But one of the things that the old syntax was telling us was that part of the magic it was doing was handling reactivity. So it would take those objects that you had in your data and it would wrap them with proxies or other methods in order to notice the change. And so really, the other thing that this introduces is for the idea of reactivity to be obvious. So what I'm actually going to do here is use a new class that's only in the composition API called, method called ref. If we import it from view, you'll see it's just in the pure view object. And what ref does is say, oh, I have a value that's the actual underlying value of whatever I've put in here. In this case, it's an array. And so when value gets set, that's how this becomes reactive. This can tell anybody that cares about book list, like my v4 here, that it's going to be returned. Now, having to think about the reactivity at first, I was a little worried about. I was like, I kind of like that the magic does it for me. But here, it's very clear what's happening, so that when I'm maintaining the code longer term, I know what kind of reactivity matters. Now, I don't need reactivity here if I wasn't going to ever change it and want the UI to respond to it. So I did name equals Shawn, right? Just a plain old name, and returned it. And let's put it in the UI here. It still works. If it's loading at all at this point. Yeah, this still works. Because the only thing that reactivity is important for is when something changes to have the UI react to it. You know, the basic idea of reactivity there. So if I have things that aren't necessarily going to change over time, I don't need reactivity, but I need it in book list because it's going to start empty and then get filled with this object. And as those objects change, I'm going to want to know about those reactivities. So let's, I have our load function here, but I'm not calling it anywhere, right? I could put load here, but that's not really going to bias a lot. So what we're going to do is I'm actually going to give it a, I forgot this takes a parameter called science fiction that we're just going to hard code for now. And so I want to know, how do I actually load this? And there is another part of the composition API that exports a function called unmounted. You can see that when I put it in, it knew well enough that it's from view. It went ahead and added it for me as an import. And this just takes a function that gets executed on when the form is loaded, just like we saw before. Now, the interesting thing is, I'll go ahead and just call await load, is that this unmounted doesn't need to be exported, right? It's just calling this because that unmounted is going to just queue it up as part of this object, and that we can use load again because of that closure idea. And we can now see that at this point we have a lot of the functionality we had before. The mark reading isn't working, but on the short sort of part of this, it's actually working the way we need. We're actually missing this other piece, which is mark read, right? On click, I want to be able to call a method called mark read. So let's implement that as well. And this is going to pass in whatever book is in there, and we're just going to say book dot checked out. Actually, not read. It should say checked out, but I'm abusing it for the demo. And here you'll notice that Visual Studio Code says this is grayed out because I'm not actually referring to this anywhere, and that's sort of a clue to me that mark read should be exposed on this object, because again, this object is everything that I want to be able to call from the template. And so we should be able to go read, 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 and read, right? We get the same functionality we had before. So if I can just sort of duplicate this, what is the benefit here? And there's a few benefits. One is that I can compose this not by writing it in here, but I could actually, let's go ahead and create a new file, and I'll call it our book factory, for lack of a better word. It's not quite what it is, but it'll do. I'm going to export default function. I called it a factory. Let's make it a function. And let's go ahead and just take all of this stuff and put it in this. Again, we're still getting it in the same way. Let me just add these couple that I need in here. Should be everything. Yeah, let's do it that way. And then this could return the same idea, right? Or you could have separate exports for each one of these if you didn't need to do them all. But let's say book list name. Probably could have gotten this from the other one. And mark read. And what's interesting thing about this is now that we've decoupled it from that UI, we could import this into our test and just run it, right? To see what the inputs and outputs are actually going to be. When I call load, will it fill in the book list? So it becomes this easier thing. And this was the part that was really hard with the options API, was being able to do something like books. Let's call it books for lack of a better word. Close. Let's go ahead and see if it'll let me bring it in. Yep. And then what do I do here? In this case, all I'm going to do is just say, or I could have decoupled it, right? I'm taking this whole thing I've created and I'm just applying it here. And if I did it right, it all should still work. And so it allows me to compose it from different smaller pieces. And you would do that in the original view with the options API by writing these add-ins. And they weren't hard to write, but they were weird and they were untestable. And that's sort of the reason why I like compose, because it ends up being very much just JavaScript, right? There isn't a lot of this magic going on. So let's extend this a little. There's a couple more ideas that are happening here that are important. And that is, in the way we used to have sections, we now will just have methods. So let's create a computed value. And we're going to create it and just call it, let's say, red count. And what could that red count be? That could be book list, filter, forgot what it is suddenly. Checked out there. Right, I'm just going to compute what, oh, I forgot to do value here. I'm just going to compute how many items on this list are checked out, so I can put them on the page. And so let's go ahead and return that computed, just like it was anything else. You know, again, these are just objects that you're returning. They're not special. We don't have to categorize them in special ways. And this computed is from view as well, right? So you can have computed that does this sort of thing. And this is reactive, so that every time the book list changes, it'll recompute this and let it know about it as well. So this is the way you would do being able to see things that are different. And so in the UI, let's go ahead and just add a line up here that says total books read. What did I call it? Red count. That sound right? Yep. And this doesn't need to change because I've buried it inside this factory method, though it could all be defined here as well. This isn't the necessity, but it gives you more flexibility so that you could do it if you want to do it. Let's see if that actually works. Right? We're immediately getting some of the same types of functions that we had before. And let's continue this down a bit, because there's a few other sort of features that you would think are a bit harder to deal with. Now, this is still at its core just the options API. So you still define things like properties in the same way. I'm going to say the category is a string. We're going to have a property that's going to be required. And I'm going to use that category by passing in props. Setup has an optional first property that is the list of props that you've defined here as they're set in. And so let's go props.category. So that we can go ahead and just say category, and we'll use that here for weight books, right? Now, the interesting thing about this is props notifies when these changes happen. So just passing in the category isn't actually good enough. We're probably going to want to pass the prop object down. And let's do that here differently so that we know when the category changes. And we'll actually implement this in a minute. Let's go over to our main view where we're hosting this. And this is where we're using this book object. And so let's go ahead and say category. I don't need to bind it yet as, let's do technology, just so you know that it's getting it from this books. Now we're getting technology books instead. Not sure timeline and Prey or technology, but you know, upgrading and repairing PCs certainly is. And so the idea of passing down properties becomes sort of that same idea. And let's do this so we can see the whole thing work. So I'm going to create a select statement. whose V model is category. And so we're going to need in our object now here data element returns category. Let's call it science. Let's call it technology. Technology. Thank you. Everyone's screaming into their screens right now going, it's technology. Then I'm going to create a couple of options for technology. I'm going to give you the value because the value we actually pass into the API has to be lowercase. So technology. Create a couple of these so we can actually see them work in science, science fiction, and what is another one? It's not history, biography. Is that right? And then here we can have, whenever the control changes, use our category, right? Because now this category, when this changes it, this gets changed. This is going to push down the change through our properties, if that makes sense. Let's see if I screwed this up or I made it work right. Science, science fiction. Why aren't you? Oh, that's right. I actually did that on purpose. Now, there's a reason why this doesn't do it, because the only time we're loading the data is on mounted. And so we can actually use, and this is where the last of the kind of major features here, and that is something called a watch. Now there's two, in the composition API, there's really two of these. There's watch and watch effect. Watch effect says if anything changes, run this code so that I can deal with changes. The watch only looks for a change in one thing. And so in our case, I'm going to say props.category. When the category changes, I'm going to call load. And watch, unsurprisingly, is another part of the information from view. And if we've done this right, we get that notification of the change, and then we can reload all the books. So getting all of this working. And this is going to allow us to sort of compose this, because one of the things I think is important here, and I think I've talked really fast, is that this doesn't have to be composed of just a single thing here. You can imagine if you have a weight cursor, you might want to bring it in, or if you have functionality about what to do with the toolbar, bring it in. Like, you can compose it from these pieces much easier. The options API, everything really needed to exist in that one options object, and extending that was difficult, and it wasn't changeable at runtime. And so we didn't have sort of that benefit of doing that. These things are not used anymore. And so for me, the options API is crucial in this idea. This also becomes important when you start to think about the way that things like routing and Vuex, or using another method for doing that. Because in some cases, for small sort of applications, ref becomes a replacement, or reactive, there's actually another method, becomes a replacement for needing Vuex in simple cases. When you get into complex cases where you need that hierarchy, then you can sort of fall down to Vuex instead of having to use it on every object. I did want to explore one more idea before we completed it, and that is, let's go back to Book Factory. We also might want to fire events, right? And so let's go to our load here, and let's add the ability to emit an event. And this used to be, in the options API, you used to see a lot of special this dot, like emit was a method on there. And because there is no magic this pointer anymore, we need to be able to get it, just like we did props. What we do is this props also has a secondary object called options. So let's go ahead and pass in options.emit. But of course, we all forgot that this was JavaScript. If I only need emit, I don't need options at all. I can just say emit, right? I can structure the emit, so it's just an object on its own. And there's a couple more pieces in here that are interesting about different objects you can get at, but emit is the one that's almost always the main one used. Down here, we can now say emit. Oh, actually, don't do it here. Let's do it here. red. And let's do book.title. And you're going to need to give it a name of the event, book red. Right. So what do? This gets emitted with it, but back here in app, we can then say on here, book red at book red equals notify book red, let's call it. We're going to need a method. One of the reasons I'm using the options API here is to show you that it isn't an all or nothing. You can opt into using one or all three of these different methods interchangeably. They all end up at runtime very much the similar thing. It's much more about how hard it is to handle the style of development. And I just find the the composition API a lot easier to work with. I recently did some work for an open source nonprofit project, and they were using Vue 2 because of some dependencies they had. And I just slotted my composition API next to it, and it all just worked. We didn't need to like convert the whole project. So here, let's say message and alert. Message. You should never use alert in your own code, but this will do for now. What did I do wrong that it hated? Unterminated template. Okay, hold on. I must have broke this. Terminated. Oh, there we go. All is fine in the world today. So now that we've added that event, we'll now get the alerts. So we're seeing that with this new method, we can really do a lot of what we were used to doing before, but it ends up being much more naturally JavaScript instead of being this magic options object that you need to have everything in the same place. Questions? Did I run roughshod over everybody? No questions. So let me go through my last slide real quick, just so you know where to get this. Vuejs.org, and this demo and slides, which who knows how helpful these slides will be, but will be at my blog probably late tonight, tomorrow morning, if you want to get them. I'm going to keep on presenting in case you want me to show something else, but are there any questions?
I'm not smart enough to ask good questions on this.
They don't have to be good.
I have a quick question.
Sure, Walter?
Yeah. How would the composition API just kind of replace mixins if you're going to be using those like just plain JavaScript files? I mean, do you need mixins at all?
You don't. That's one of the compelling thing for me is mixins are just importing of other code, right? It doesn't need to be this magic format to sneak itself into the options. It's one of the reasons I really like this. So whether you're importing it as a factory like I did, or you're importing it as an object, or whatever way, it's just more code inside the JavaScript. And so you don't have to have a special mechanism for it. It's just JavaScript or TypeScript.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for the demo. That was really helpful.
Sure. And the person who thought they didn't have a good question, did you have a dumb question?
No dumb questions either at the moment.
No, I know I wasn't that clear. So any other questions before we break and I pass it back over to Tolga? About this or not about this? Wow, there's a quiet group. Normally they're only this quiet in Holland.
I don't do much Vue, but is this? I mean, I get the sense that this is fairly new to Vue. Is that right? Is it just picking up, or is it got a good
It was
following?
introduced almost 2 years ago, so it's not terribly new.
Okay.
But I think it's the way that people are thinking about the future of new development. Now, a lot of people have existing development using the options or even the class style syntax. So I think you're seeing this being the default option much more. And the templates reflect that, and the templates are now using the options, the composition API as the defaults.
Oh, okay.
So Henry can't get his microphone to work. Is there standard way to handle state like Redux in React? Yeah, it's called Vuex. They're very clever with their trying to have the same sort of name. But it's interesting. I wrote an article for Code Magazine that talked about this because with the composition UI, with the composition API, you can use something like Vuex to handle state, to handle app state, and that certainly works. But you don't have to in that you can just use simpler methods when it's required. Like if I'm doing a much simpler, like I'm handling a simple form or a checkout on a website, sometimes having the heaviness of that app state isn't as important. So I'll just expose an object that has all my state that I can share amongst them, which is really easy with this. Or if I'm using Vuex, like I show in the article, you can continue to use Vuex. You just end up making computed properties based on the object so that when the Vuex changes, those computed properties are then reflected in it. So take a look at Vuex. I also have an article specifically about Vuex in Code Magazine a couple issues ago, I think. So might be something to read through. There's some demo code there that might help you get started. Other questions?
How do we find your articles?
I should have an article section on my website, and I don't yet. But if you go to Code Magazine and search for my name, you'll see them. I have except for the current issue, I have an article in pretty much every issue, and they're almost always about Vue. So,
oh wow, okay.
There's probably 10 up there over the last year and a half. So if you're just getting started in Vue, it's actually not a bad way to get started. I also have a free Vue 2 course. It's kind of long in the teeth, but it's on YouTube. So if you go to YouTube/Shawn Wildermuth, there's a section for courses, and you can take it. It's about a 4-hour course on how Vue works with ASP.NET Core more specifically, but it's mostly concerned with Vue. So if you want a free actual course, you can go up there. I've released some of my non-Pluralsight courses up on YouTube for free. So there's one on SignalR, there's one on Bootstrap 4, and the one on Vue as well. It's a short one on Font Awesome as well, but that's like a half an hour. There's not a lot to cover there.
Do you do any React as well? I see you do .NET from your YouTube channel.
Yeah, I do .NET, Vue, and Angular. JSX makes some part of my brain hurt. I just don't like it. And there's so many other people covering React well that it didn't seem that important for me to learn to become an expert in it. I've used it. I've done it for small projects. I just don't like it. Everyone has things they love and hate, and React is just I'd already learned so many. At that time, I had learned Svelte, and I'd learned I don't know how many other SPA packages. So I let it go. I didn't expect it to become the most popular one.
Yeah, you have to pick your technologies you're going to master, and you can't master everything. I did the same thing. We went Angular. My company went Angular pretty early on, and just dive deep there. But then I feel bad because it's not the popular kid on the block anymore. But
no, but it's still. I mean, it still has huge numbers, just because so many companies adopted it early. And I teach it quite a bit to my consulting clients and help them where I just sort of coach them through Angular problems as well. And even suggested in some cases, because Angular and React have the benefit of non-technical benefits. So when you're hiring in certain areas and you need to hire a bunch of people, picking something like Svelte or even Vue to some respect, you're going to have a smaller pool of developers than if you pick Angular and React. And so sometimes it's a non-technical reason why I suggest those to clients. It isn't, the fact is that every framework has its compromises, and figuring out how those compromises match to yours is great. But sometimes it's also about non-technical decisions, and it isn't always as simple as going React's the best and Angular sucks. But that doesn't help any of the conversations. But if you live in an area where React is big, like the Bay, like San Francisco Bay, React is a great choice, technically and probably so you can hire the right people. But if you're in Utah, Angular might be a better, because for some reason Angular is huge in Utah. Like you have to really understand your market a little, and that usually isn't the reason, but it can help make some of those decisions over time.
Definitely.
I noticed that you were just using plain JavaScript. I know that TypeScript with Vue 3, I think, is a first class citizen, so to speak.
It is.
Would you recommend, or in your experience, do you prefer JavaScript or TypeScript with Vue?
Now that I'm using Vue 3, I prefer TypeScript, especially if it's a medium-sized project or larger, just because it really does help you develop quicker. The type safety helps you have fewer errors and such. I do most of my demos in JavaScript because it's I don't have to teach both things at once and try to explain why we're doing one thing. Because the TypeScript compiler will stop you from doing things that are perfectly valid in JavaScript because they're trying to guess what the types are and infer the types. And so sometimes that can get in your way a little, especially in a demo. But in a large project, I use TypeScript, preferably actually. It's caught and fixed things that I never could.
It's a great question. I like the answer. I love TypeScript. Well, of course, if you're an Angular person, you're
you're tied into it. Well, you could learn Dart. I mean,
yeah.
I have
Okay.
a friend who works at Google that's working with the Flutter team, and he was like, "Now that I've learned Dart, it's really great." I'm like, "No, you're just in the bubble. No one wants to learn Dart." The Angular team didn't want to use Dart, so
that should say something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I love TypeScript.
Well, I appreciate you letting me do this. I'm happy to have shown you some things, and if you have any other questions and you're a little shy in front of the group, you can always contact me on my website, wildermuth.com. Little contact plates there, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thanks a lot, Shawn. It's great. Thanks.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much, Shawn.
Thank you.
Okay, so small preview for next month's session. Again, we're meeting the first Thursday of next month, just like any other month. Next month, we have Jim Woolley. He's going to be talking about reactive extensions in action. And I think that's going to also be another fantastic talk. Looking forward to having everybody join and meet up once again. Thank you again, Shawn.
Thanks again. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys. Have a good night.